asked the question, is God dead? And that prompted a guy we know as A.W. Dykes to write a song, Our God, He is alive. Answering that question, yes, God is not dead. He is very much alive. So much of our society, even today, mocks the idea of God. They sneer at the idea of judgment. And sometimes I think as God's people, we think we are the first generation in all of human history to live in a society that rejects the idea of God, that scoffs at the idea of judgment. But we look at the Bible, we look at secular history, and we learn very quickly that's not the case. From the beginning of time, going all the way back to Genesis, we see very clearly that mankind has rejected the one true God. And that leads David to say in Psalm 53, verse 1, the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. When we read David's words there in Psalm 53, verse 1, what comes to our mind? Is it that atheist, agnostic teacher we're so scared about our kids getting when they go to school or they go off to college? Is it that neighbor next door that cusses like a sailor, drinks like a fish, and is involved in all sorts of ungodly activities that we look next door and go, they'll never obey the gospel. They are so ungodly. But what if that fool there in Psalm 53 in verse 1 describes us? Today I want to look at Psalm 53 together. It was part of our daily Bible reading last week, and we're going to look through it together and just walk through this text together to see how David describes the folly of fools. Because I think this psalm teaches us three lessons, three reminders, three things that I think will challenge us to look at our heart and answer the question, am I the fool here in this text? And while you're getting to your Psalm 53 in your Bible, I want to let you know that Psalm 53 has a twin. There's another psalm in our Bibles that looks very similar to Psalm 53. It's Psalm 14. In fact, if we were to put those two psalms side by side, they're almost word for word identical except for a couple of places. But it's where they differ tells us something about the point of Psalm 53, and we'll see that later in a moment. But both of these psalms, Psalm 53 and Psalm 14, describe the fool. They describe the consequences of rejecting God, but they also provide hope for the godly. As we begin tonight, let's just go ahead and read Psalm 53. It's a very, very long psalm. It's only 6 verses, so we're just going to read all of it together and then start to unpack it. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt and they do vile deeds. There is no one who does good. God looks down from heaven on the human race to see if there is one who is wise, one who seeks God. All have turned away. All alike have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Will evildoers never understand? They consume my people as they consume bread. They do not call on God. Then they will be filled with dread. Dread like no other, because God will scatter the bones of those who besiege you. You will be put to shame, for God has rejected them. Oh, that Israel's deliverance would come from Zion. When God restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad. David begins that psalm there in Psalm 53 by declaring the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. When David describes the fool, he is not looking at a guy who has a low IQ. He's not looking at a guy who may not have an academic credential, may not have a trade school degree, he may not have a college degree, he may not have a PhD. David looks at the fool and says, the fool is not somebody without intelligence. The fool is someone who says in his heart, there is no God. And that's important for us to remember, because the fool, as David describes him here in Psalm 53, is anyone and everyone who denies God. Period. No exceptions. That's the first reminder for us here in the text that we see here in Psalm 53, verses 1 through 3, the heart of fools. You know, even today we use the word fool kind of casually. We may say that someone's acting like a fool, and we don't mean they're denying the existence of God by their actions. We just mean they're being a little crazy, a little immature. They're acting foolishly. But when the Bible uses the word fool, it's used to describe one who turns away from God. The Bible does not use the word fool casually. And so when it does use the word fool, we probably do need to pay attention, because the fool is anyone and everyone who rejects God. And why do they reject God? Look there in the text one more time. 53 verse 1, the fool says in his heart. The reason why the fool rejects God, it's not a matter of intellectual problem. It's not that they can't fathom the existence of God. It's not that they don't look at creation and acknowledge there is some creator. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. That ultimately for the fool, the reason they deny the existence of God, it's right here. It's in their heart. And because, as we've seen in our study this month, that the heart is the center of our life, and that everything we do flows out of our heart, the fool's God-denying heart produces a God-denying life. That's what we see here in Psalm 53, verses 1 through 3. The belief that there is no God is revealed in their godless behavior. Look how their behavior is described. They are corrupt. They do vile deeds. There is no one, verse 1, who does good. All have turned away. All alike have become corrupt. There is no one who does good. The fool lives every day, David says, as if there is no God. And because there is no God, there is no consequences for his actions. You know, as I read the description there of the fool there in Psalm 53, what comes to my mind at least is Judges, the book of Judges, rather. See, the book of Judges is a vivid description of what happens when a society rejects God. If you read the entire book of Judges, you see what happens when Israel says in their heart there is no God. And because they've said in their heart there is no God, by the end of the book of Judges, it tells us that every man does what is right in his own eyes. That because they have rejected God, it doesn't matter what they did. No one's going to judge them. Because they had rejected God, they lived godlessly. And on some level, this describes our society today. Those of you who are a little older than me have seen on some level, on some societal level, how as our society has rejected God more and more and more, at least has it become a little more acceptable to reject God, how that's affected our overall life. That's the attitude I think that David is trying to address here in Psalm 53. That your God-denying or a God-denying heart lives a God-denying life. That when we look in our heart, like they did in the time of Judges, and say, there is no God, God's not going to do anything, I'm going to set the standard, it's going to be displayed in our overall behavior. And that's what we see there in the text. Meanwhile, God is looking down there in verse 2, and he looks down from heaven on the human race to see if there is anyone who is wise, to see if anyone who's not acting like a fool, to see if anyone is seeking God. And when God looks down on his creation, the people he breathed life to, the people he loves, he looks down and sees that they're all acting like fools. That there is no one who seeks God. There is no one who cares about God. Everyone is running away from the idea of God. And so when we read this description of the fools here in Psalm 53, verses 1 through 3, we need to realize that the fools that David describes there in the text are everywhere around us. But they're also inside us. Because much like David's world, much like David's life, we have a tendency from time to time to deny God in our hearts. And yet so often we look at this fool there in Psalm 53 verse 1 and we go, I can think of 100 people this describes. I can think of that atheist teacher or that agnostic teacher, that godless neighbor, that person at work. That's the fool that David's talking about. But when the rubber meets the road and we look at our life, we act like fools too. Look one more time at verse 3. I'm going to try to highlight something that David says there in verse 3, where he says, all have turned away. All alike have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. What is David telling us there in Psalm 53? David is telling us that all have done wrong. All have sinned. Do you know what the word all means? I know I'm going to violate every rule of grammar here, but all means all. I don't know how else to define the word all, but it includes everyone. David says everyone does bad. Everyone is corrupt. Everyone has sinned. Everyone has turned away. David's not commenting on the fools of his day. He's commenting on the fools of our day. He's commenting on us. In fact, Paul's going to pick up on this text in Romans chapter 3. In Romans chapter 3, as Paul is describing the state of the world, how there in Romans 1, the Gentiles have sinned. And in Romans 2, the Jews have sinned. And finally, there in Romans chapter 3, he goes, all have sinned. All of us there in Romans chapter 3 have played the fool. We've all fallen short, he says in Romans 3:23. We've all turned aside to our own way. And each and every time you and we sin, we are looking up to God. We are looking up to our Creator, and we are saying in our heart, there is no God. And this means that every time we cheat on that test, every time we lie, every time we lust, every time we sin, every time we get mad at our waiter on a Sunday afternoon for messing up our order, we are saying in our heart, there is no God. That's how we play the fool. Because a fool says in his heart, there is no God who will judge us for our sin. There is no God who will judge us for our lying. There is no God who will judge us for our cheating. There is no God who will judge us for our anger. There is no God who will judge us for our lusting. That's how fools reject God in their heart. But David goes on there in the text in verse 4 to describe how rejecting God has consequences. Consequences that sometimes the fool doesn't completely understand. And so David there in verse 4 goes on to say, will they never understand? They consume my people like they consume bread. Will they ever see things, David says, like God sees them? And David realizes they are too busy oppressing people to understand the consequences of their actions. They're not just rejecting God in their heart. Now they've started to reject God in their lifestyle. And so they're abusing people. They're oppressing people. That's why they don't call upon God, because they realize if they call upon God, that exposes their injustice. And here's what the wicked don't understand here in Psalm 53. Pretending there is no God doesn't make it true, and it won't make the judgment go away. In fact, there in the text, there in verse 5, David's able to look forward. He's able to look past the fool's rejection of God, and he's able to look past their sin and their oppression and their injustice, and he's able to see the ultimate destiny of the fools, and that is judgment. That's the second reminder for us here in the text. That the destiny of fools is the judgment of God. And that's something the fools there in Psalm 53 could never understand. The fool there in Psalm 53 was confident that God didn't exist. The fool in Psalm 53 was confident that if God did exist, he couldn't see his sin. They were confident that if God existed, then he couldn't do anything about his sin. That is until judgment came, and then, and only then, was the fool terrified. Because God has finally handed them over for judgment. And you can see that judgment described there in verse 5, how they're filled with dread, how they're filled with terror, because God will scatter the bones of those who besiege you. They will be put to shame because God has rejected them. That's the coming judgment on the fool. And again, that's something we see there in Romans chapter 1. Paul loves, apparently, Psalm 53 there in Romans first 3 chapters in particular, as God or Paul is describing that Gentile lifestyle there in the text and how those Gentiles there in Romans chapter 1 had rejected God. And go ahead and go over to Romans chapter 1 just real quickly. We got a little bit of time tonight to go to Romans chapter 1. He's describing their Gentile lifestyle and how God's wrath there in Romans 1 verse 18 is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness, who are suppressing the truth, verse 18. And so what God does is say, you've rejected me, you denied my existence. God there in verse 24 says, okay, have it your way. I'm going to deliver you over to the desires of your hearts. I'm going to deliver you over to disgraceful passions. I'm going to deliver you over, verse 28, to a corrupt mind, so you do what is not right. And finally, he describes all these sins that they're involved in 29 and 30 and 31, things like unrighteousness and evil and greed and wickedness, murder and quarrels and deceit, arrogance and boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. Hey kids, I hope you're paying attention to that one. Senselessness, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And what's the end result of all this? Look at verse 32. That although they knew God's just sentence, that those who practice such things deserve to die. Paul describes the ultimate destiny of fools. The ultimate destiny of those who reject God as king of their life. And so what Psalm 53, what Romans 1 are painting for us is a picture of a life without God. Shame, judgment. That's our destiny too. Paul and David take this train of thought, this idea that when you reject God, judgment will come. They take that train of thought to the same conclusion. What we need to realize is that we all have sinned. We've all acted like a fool. We all deserve judgment. That's our destiny. And so I think there's a huge warning for us here in Psalm 53. That if we reject God now, if we deny God in our hearts now, if we deny God in our lives now, God will reject us. He will look at us at that great day that is coming, when we stand before God and he says, you denied me during your life, I'm going to deny you now. Enter into judgment. That's what we can expect on that great day. Judgment will be our destiny. And we will have no rest in death. That's why David describes it as scattering the bones of those who besiege you. He says they're not going to have any rest, even in death. We're going to spend eternity in a place where the fire doesn't go out. That's the destiny of fools. And this should be a huge wake-up call to all of us, because it highlights that our ultimate destiny is judgment unless we repent. And this is really where we see the biggest difference between Psalm 14 and Psalm 53. Psalm 14, if we were to read that tonight, focuses a lot on God being with the righteous. But in contrast to God being with the righteous there in Psalm 14, Psalm 53 says God is not with the wicked. God is against the wicked. God is going to judge the wicked. And we read that contrast. We see that contrast between Psalm 14 and Psalm 53, and we're going, okay, there's no hope for us. This is pretty depressing when we read Psalm 53. But that's not the end of the story. The psalm doesn't end there. It goes on there in verse 6. We'll read it one more time. Oh, that Israel's deliverance would come from Zion. When God restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. That's the condition of our heart. That's the condition of my heart. That's the condition of your heart. We've all in our life have denied God. We all have not called on God. We have not sought God. We have turned away from God. We all deserve judgment. That's bad news for all of us. But there's another opportunity that's placed before us there in verse 6, and that's deliverance. That there is deliverance even for fools. There is hope. That even rebellious fools like you and me, we can be saved if only we will cry out to God just like David does there in verse 6. You see, David knows there are two basic type of people in this world. There's the wicked over here that face the wrath of God. And there are the righteous over here that's saved by the grace of God. And David says here in verse 6, at least as I read it, I want to be in that second group. I want to be in the group that's saved by the grace of God. I want to be in the group that has cried out to God for deliverance. What's interesting is David describes the group that's going to be saved, the group that's going to be delivered. The group that's going to rejoice it's not a group that's smarter. It's not a group that's richer. It's not a group that's just better people overall. It's simply those who have cried out to God for deliverance. David knows he's a sinner. He includes himself there in verse 3, that all have sinned, all have turned away. That's who David includes there in verse 3. But David also knows there in verse 6 that God has always saved those who cry out to him. So he cries out for the salvation that comes from Zion. And when the righteous are delivered, when they are restored, they rejoice. They are glad. They were lost. They were bound for judgment. But now they have been saved. And that leads them to rejoice because they have hope. Have you ever been lost? Like really lost? Like lost before the days you had MapQuest on your smartphone lost? Like when you're lost and you're sitting there going, honey, I think we should stop at that gas station. And your husband's like, no, I got this. And you're like, honey, we haven't seen a gas station in 2 hours. I really think you should stop. There was a time when I was doing a preaching internship in Georgia. I had a preaching appointment at a small country church, about 60 people. And I was lost on a Sunday night. And when I finally found where I was supposed to be, I had planned to arrive like 30 or 45 minutes early. But when I finally got to where I was supposed to be, I had never seen a happier preacher. Because the preacher who works there was like, finally, he showed up. I don't have to put something together on the fly. And I was rejoicing as well because I wasn't lost in the middle of middle Georgia. I had found what I came looking for. We always rejoice when we're no longer lost, whatever that loss may be. But I'm not sure we fully appreciate how lost we were before Jesus. And because we don't fully appreciate how lost we were before Jesus, we don't fully appreciate the joy of our salvation. I mean, when was the last time that you rejoiced? When you were glad? I mean, like really, really, really rejoiced in your salvation. And I think that's why Psalm 53 is so important for us. Because it reminds us that we're all fools there in the first 3 verses. It describes the judgment that is coming for us, but it also reminds us that there is salvation for all those who cry out to Zion for deliverance. That even though you and I, we have all turned away from God, God did not turn away from us. God still delivers his people, even fools like us. Think about that. That even though you and I deny that God exists in our heart, God has never denied that we exist in his heart. Even to the point where God sent his Son, his only Son, on a salvation mission so that you and I, those of us who have rejected God in our hearts, could be saved from the wrath to come. That's the message of the gospel. You know, there's something very interesting there in Psalm 53 and verse 6 where it says, "Oh, that Israel's deliverance," your translation may say salvation, "would come from Zion." That word there is Yeshua. Or as we would say, Joshua. Or as we would say in the New Testament, Jesus. Oh, that Jesus, oh, that salvation would come from Zion. Guys, that's how we're saved. Even today, how you and I, that we've turned away, that we've become corrupt, we are saved because Jesus came from Zion and died on a cross for our sins. And maybe today you're ready to turn away from that life of sin and turn toward your Savior, toward the Yeshua, the Jesus of Zion, who stands ready to deliver you not from life without God, but deliver you to life with God forevermore. If we can help you with anything, if we can help you come to salvation tonight, please let us know while together we stand and sing.